Before the dawn of the written word, there was only the memory of the blood debt. In the cradle of civilization, between the Tigris and the Euphrates, life was governed by the oldest rule in nature, the rule of the pack. If a neighbor stole your grain, you burned his field. If a stranger struck your child, you wiped out his lineage. Justice was a circle that never closed. It was a cycle of vendetta that drained the lifeblood of the first human settlements. For thousands of years, the world was a landscape of arbitrary whims, where right was simply whatever the man with the largest bronze axe said it was. But as the small mud-brick villages of Mesopotamia began to swell into the world's first true cities, the old tribal ways began to fail. You cannot build a civilization on a foundation of eternal revenge. The people needed a shepherd. And in the year 1792 BCE, a young man ascended the throne of a small, relatively insignificant city called Babylon. His name was Hammurabi.
Hammurabi was not born to an empire. He inherited a city-state that was barely 50 miles wide, surrounded by aggressive, powerful rivals. The Elamites to the east, the Assyrians to the north, and the city of Larsa to the south. For the first 20 years of his reign, Hammurabi was the silent king. He focused on the foundations. He built massive city walls. He dug canals that turned the desert into a lush garden of barley and dates. He fortified his temples and polished his diplomacy. Then the silence broke. Through a series of brilliant and often ruthless military campaigns, Hammurabi dismantled his enemies. One by one, the ancient cities of Sumer and Akkad fell to his chariots and infantry. By the 30th year of his reign, the king of the 4 quarters of the world stood at the center of an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the borders of modern-day Turkey.
But Hammurabi knew something that many conquerors in history would go on to ignore. An empire built on blood cannot be sustained by blood alone. Babylon was now a chaotic, multi-ethnic superpower. It was the New York City of the ancient world. It was home to tens of thousands of people who spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and brought with them the conflicting customs of a dozen different conquered lands. Imagine a dispute in the market. A Sumerian baker and an Amorite soldier get into a fight over a sack of grain. Under Sumerian tradition, the baker might owe a fine. Under Amorite tribal law, the soldier might be entitled to strike the baker. If every dispute was settled by a different set of rules, the empire would tear itself apart from the inside. The king was being flooded with appeals. Thousands of people were traveling to Babylon to ask the king to settle their local squabbles. Hammurabi realized that to hold his people together, he didn't just need more soldiers. He needed a shared reality. He needed a system where a merchant in the north and a farmer in the south were playing by the exact same set of rules. He needed to take the power of judgment out of the hands of the capricious gods and the violent tribes and place it into the hands of the state. In his own inscriptions, Hammurabi didn't call himself a god king or a lord of war. He chose a more humble title, Reum, the shepherd. He viewed his subjects as a flock that needed to be protected from the predators, even if those predators were the people's own masters. He spent years studying the ancient laws of kings who came before him, like Ur-Nammu and Lipit Ishtar. But he found their laws to be incomplete, hidden away in dusty temple libraries where only priests could read them. Hammurabi's vision was something far more radical.
He wanted to create a law of the land that was so visible, so permanent, and so clear that no man, not even a judge or a nobleman, could pretend he didn't know the rules. He wanted to anchor his empire in stone. In the final decade of his life, Hammurabi called for his master stone carvers. He sent them to the mountains to find the hardest rock known to man, black basalt. The era of the king's whim was about to end. The era of the king's law was about to begin. Next, we see what was carved into that stone, and how it would change the meaning of justice forever. If you want a law to last forever, you do not write it on clay. Clay was the medium of the merchant. It was for the tallying of sheep and the recording of debts. Clay could be broken, soaked in water, or erased. To the Babylonians, clay was as temporary as the mud of the riverbanks. For his master work, Hammurabi demanded the bone of the earth. He sent expeditions to the northern mountains to find black basalt.
Basalt is one of the hardest stones in existence. It is a volcanic rock that resists the wind, the rain, and the passage of centuries. By choosing this medium, Hammurabi was making a statement. This law is heavier than your opinions. It is more durable than your life. It is absolute. But before a single word of the 282 laws was carved, Hammurabi had to establish his authority. He had to answer the most dangerous question any subject can ask a king. Why should I obey you? At the top of the 7-foot pillar, Hammurabi placed a masterstroke of political theater. It is an image of the king standing before Shamash, the sun god. In Mesopotamian belief, Shamash was the great judge who saw everything be light-touched. From his shoulders, rays of fire emerge. This was the divine seal of approval. Hammurabi wasn't just a lawmaker, he was an architect, and these laws were the measuring tools to build a perfect society.
By placing this image at the top of the stone, Hammurabi was telling his people, "These are not my laws. I am merely the scribe. If you break these rules, you are not just defying your king, you are defying the sun itself." In an age where the gods were feared above all else, this wasn't just law, it was a holy covenant. Below the feet of the gods, the work began. The scribes wrote in Akkadian, the lingua franca of the empire. It was the language of the street, the market, and the soldier. Hammurabi wanted no ambiguity. He wanted the law to speak in the tongue of the people. For months, the sound of the chisel echoed in the royal workshops. 28 separate columns of text, over 3,600 lines of script. The code was structured with mathematical precision. It began with a prologue, a poetic boast of Hammurabi's greatness. Then the heart of the matter, 282 specific laws, covering every conceivable human interaction, from kidnapping to the cost of hiring a boat.
And finally, it ended with an epilogue, a blessing for those who obeyed, and a terrifying curse for those who would dare to deface the stone. When the stone was finished, Hammurabi didn't hide it in his palace. He placed it in the most public space in the city. This was the true revolution. Before Hammurabi, law was something priests kept in their heads or scribes hid on shelves. It was a secret, and secrets are easily manipulated. Hammurabi's own words carved into the epilogue explain the purpose of the stone. Let any oppressed man who has a cause come before my image as king of righteousness. Let him read the inscription on my monument. Let him give heed to my weighty words, and may my monument enlighten him as to his cause, and may he understand his rights. It didn't matter if the man was illiterate. The very presence of the stone was a shield. The judge in the local court could no longer take a bribe and change the rule, because everyone knew the rule was standing in the temple square, carved in unchangeable basalt. The law was no longer a ghost, it was a physical landmark. But as the people began to read, they realized that this new order came with a heavy price. Proportional justice had arrived, and it was written in blood. Before Hammurabi, vengeance was an unchecked fire. It followed a recursive logic. You hit me, I kill you. You kill my son, I wipe out your tribe. Blood feuds lasted for generations, fueled by a pride that knew no ceiling. Hammurabi's most famous contribution to history was an attempt to put a ceiling on that fire. We know it today as Lex Talionis, the law of retaliation. It is a philosophy that sounds barbaric to the modern ear, but in 1750 BCE, it was a move toward restraint. The law stated, "If a man put out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out.
If a man knock out the teeth of his equal, his teeth shall be knocked out." This was mirror justice. It held that the punishment must exactly fit the crime, no more, no less. It effectively told the victim, the state will handle your revenge, but you are only entitled to what was taken from you. By monopolizing violence, the king ended the blood feuds that had plagued the desert for centuries. However, we must strip away the modern fantasy that eye for an eye meant everyone was equal. In Babylon, justice had a very keen eye for your social standing. Hammurabi's code was the first to formalize a rigid class system in law. If a member of the Awilu, the aristocratic elite, blinded an aristocrat, the law of retaliation applied. But if that same aristocrat blinded a mushkenu, a commoner, he didn't lose his eye, he simply paid a fine, 1 mina of silver. In the eyes of Hammurabi, the commoner's eye was worth money, the aristocrat's eye was worth an eye.
And at the bottom were the wardu, the slaves. If a man blinded another man's slave, he didn't pay the slave, he paid the owner half the slave's market value. The law treated the slave's injury not as a human tragedy, but as property damage. For the lower classes, the law was a heavy physical weight. If you couldn't pay in silver, you paid in skin and bone. There was a law for everything. Law 195. If a son strike his father, his hands shall be hewn off. Law 202. If anyone strike the body of a man higher in rank than he shall receive 60 blows with an ox whip in public. These laws weren't designed to be nice, they were designed to create fear. Hammurabi believed that the only thing keeping the city from sliding back into the chaos of the jungle was the terrifying certainty of the king's reaction. Every time someone walked past the black stele in the temple square, they were reminded of the price of their temper.
The stone was a silent executioner standing in the middle of the city. But Hammurabi's code was more than just a list of brutal maimings. While the eye for an eye section occupied the middle of the stone, the vast majority of the 282 laws were concerned with something much more sophisticated, the survival of the economy. Hammurabi realized that a society cannot thrive if people are afraid to trade, afraid to build, or afraid to marry. He was about to move from the law of the sword to the law of the contract. And in the next act, we see how he protected the ancient consumer by making professional negligence a capital offense. In Babylon, if your house fell down, it wasn't just a lawsuit, it was a death warrant.
If the eye for an eye laws were meant to stop a war, the civil laws were meant to build a city. In 1750 BCE, Babylon was experiencing an unprecedented construction boom. But with rapid growth came corruption, builders cutting corners, using cheap clay, or ignoring the structural integrity of the heavy roofs. Hammurabi knew that if a man's home was his castle, the king had to ensure that castle didn't become a tomb. Hammurabi introduced a concept we still struggle with today: total professional liability. Law 229. If a builder builds a house for someone and does not construct it properly, and the house which he built fall in and kill its owner, then that builder shall be put to death. He didn't stop there. Law 230 stated that if the collapse killed the owner's son, the builder's son was executed. This was mirror justice applied to engineering. In Babylon, you didn't just walk away with a fine or a bankruptcy filing. Your life was the collateral for your work.
Beyond the construction sites, the code reached into the palms of the merchants. Hammurabi understood that trust is the hidden currency of any empire. If people are afraid to be cheated, trade dies. The code established standardized weights and measures. If a merchant was caught using a heavy stone for buying and a light stone for selling, they weren't just fined, they were often thrown into the river. Hammurabi even regulated the tavern keepers, mostly women who ran the local watering holes. Law 108. If a wine seller does not receive grain as the price of drink, but if she receives money by the heavy weight, then they shall throw her into the water. By modern standards, drowning a bartender for overcharging sounds insane, but to Hammurabi, this was consumer protection. He was telling his people, the market is a sacred space of truth. If you lie here, you have no place in Babylon. Perhaps the most radical section of the code dealt with the home.
In most of the ancient world, marriage was a matter of tribal custom or simply taking a woman. But Hammurabi's code, Law 128, made a profound declaration. If a man take a woman to wife, but has not made a contract with her, this woman is no wife. For the first time in history, a marriage was a legal document. This contract wasn't just about love, it was about property and protection. The code gave Babylonian women rights that would have been imaginable in many later cultures. If a husband divorced his wife without cause, he was legally required to return her dowry and provide her with a portion of his fields and garden so she could support her children. It wasn't equality, but it was statutory right. It moved society from the rule of the father to the rule of the law. What Hammurabi was building in Act 4 wasn't just a list of punishments. He was building a predictable universe. If you hire a boat, you know the price.
If your grain is eaten by another man's oxen, you know the compensation. If you buy a slave who turns out to be sick, you know the return policy. By standardizing the business of life, Hammurabi turned Babylon into the financial hub of the world. Merchants from as far away as India and Egypt flocked to the city, not because it was the most beautiful, but because it was the most stable. But there was still one problem. What happened when there was no contract? What happened when it was one man's word against another? For that, Hammurabi didn't look to the builders or the merchants. He looked to the gods. He looked to the river. In the next act, we witness the trial by ordeal, where the river becomes the judge, and the gods decide who lives and who dies. Hammurabi was a pragmatist, but he was also a man of his time. He knew that for all his scribes and all his standardized weights, there were places the law could not reach. How do you judge a man when there are no witnesses? How do you settle a dispute when it is one man's word against another's? In the modern world, we look to forensics or circumstantial evidence. In Babylon, they looked to the gods. When human logic hit its limit, Hammurabi's code turned to the divine jury. To the Babylonians, the Euphrates was not just a source of water, it was a living deity known as Id, the river god. The river was seen as a sentient moral force. It could distinguish between a liar and an honest man. It was the ultimate truth-testing machine. Law 2 of the code deals with the most difficult of accusations, sorcery. Because magic was impossible to prove with physical evidence, Hammurabi mandated the river ordeal. If anyone bring an accusation of sorcery against a man, and the accused go to the river and leap into the river, if he sink in the river, his accuser shall take possession of his house.
But if the river prove that the accused is not guilty and he escape unhurt, then he who had brought the accusation shall be put to death, and he who leaped into the river shall take possession of the house of his accuser. This was not a swimming race. It was a cosmic lottery with the highest stakes imaginable. In the Babylonian mind, the river didn't kill people because of currents or exhaustion. It killed them because they were impure. If you floated, if you reached the shore, it was because the gods had literally physically rejected your guilt. The high stakes of the ordeal acted as a powerful deterrent. In a world where you could be executed for a false accusation, people were hesitant to bring a case unless they were absolutely certain or desperate. It forced the burden of truth back onto the accuser, keeping the Babylonian courts from being clogged with frivolous lawsuits. For cases that didn't require the river, there was the oath.
In Babylon, a man's word was not taken lightly, because it was given in the presence of a god who was believed to be listening. If a man claimed he was robbed but had no witnesses, he went to the temple. He declared his loss before the god. The Babylonians believed in the curse of the false oath. To lie to a god was to invite catastrophe onto your family, your health, and your house. For Hammurabi, the divine oath was the final piece of his legal architecture. It made every citizen their own policeman, terrified that the heavens would strike them down for a single dishonest sentence. Hammurabi's code was a bridge between two worlds. One foot was planted in the emerging world of contracts, evidence, and professional responsibility. The other was still rooted in a world of ghosts, gods, and sacred rivers. Together they created a cosmic balance.
Hammurabi had successfully convinced his people that the law was not just a set of rules made by a man in a palace. It was a fundamental law of the universe, as inevitable as the rising sun or the flow of the river. But empires fall, kings die, and stones are stolen. In our final act, we trace the long, strange journey of Hammurabi's stele, from its loss in the sands of time to its rediscovery in a world that had forgotten the name of the shepherd of Babylon. In 1750 BCE, the shepherd of Babylon died. Hammurabi left behind a unified empire and a city that was the envy of the world. But empires, no matter how well governed, are fragile things. Within a few generations of his death, the first Babylonian dynasty began to crumble. Invaders from the mountains, the Hittites and the Kassites, battered the city walls. The great black stele, which had stood in the temple square for decades as a symbol of unchangeable law, was about to become a victim of its own fame.
600 years after Hammurabi's death, the Elamites from modern-day Iran sacked Babylon. They didn't just want wealth, they wanted to strip the city of its pride. They took the stele of Hammurabi back to their capital, Susa. In a final act of humiliation, the Elamite king, Shutrok-Nahunte, erased several columns of the cuneiform text, planing the stone smooth so he could carve his own name into the record of history. But history is fickle.
The Elamite king never got around to writing his name. The stone remained scarred, a blank space where some of Hammurabi's laws once lived. Eventually, Susa itself fell. The city was burned, the temples collapsed, and the black pillar was buried under the shifting sands and the debris of centuries. The shepherd of Babylon was forgotten. For 2,000 years, the world moved on without him. In the winter of 1901, a French expedition led by Jacques de Morgan was excavating the Acropolis of Susa.
They weren't looking for a law code. They were looking for Elamite history. But as they dug, they found 3 massive fragments of black basalt. When they pieced them together, they realized they were looking at something that predated the Roman Republic, the Greek philosophers, and much of the Hebrew Bible. It was a window into a world that had been lost. When the text was finally translated, it sent a shockwave through the halls of history. The impact of the discovery was immediate. Historians realized that the Mosaic law of the Bible, the famous commands given to Moses, shared a common ancestor with the black stone of Babylon. But the legacy went further. When the Romans drafted the 12 tables, the first foundation of Western law, they used the same if-then logic that Hammurabi had pioneered. Hammurabi established the 3 pillars that hold up modern justice. Public law, the idea that rules must be written and visible to all.
Statutory liability, the idea that professionals are responsible for their work. Presumption of innocence, the code placed the burden of proof on the accuser. If you couldn't prove your case, you faced the punishment yourself. We are still living in the world that Hammurabi's carvers chiseled into that basalt. Today, the stele of Hammurabi sits in the Louvre Museum. It is no longer a shepherd to an empire, but it remains a witness to the human story. It tells us that the struggle for justice is as old as the cities themselves. It reminds us that right should not be whatever the powerful decide, but what is carved in the stone of truth. Hammurabi once wrote in his epilogue, "May my monument enlighten him, and may he understand his rights." 4,000 years later, the stone is still speaking, the mountain of stone is still standing, and the law is still king.